Good morning, everyone. I just wanted to respond to a couple of comments, briefly if I can. Probably can't. I'm going to start with, I think it's Eat Right, a comment left on a recent video, basically with some very kind words, and I thank you very much for those kind words, saying sort of this channel is great, modern political discourse is tedious or something like that, and this is refreshing, and I really appreciate the encouragement. And Eat had also asked me a question about if the political divisiveness or, basically this idea that in Canada and in the US, but he was asking about Canada specifically, really kind of globally, but in Canada specifically, if people had become more divided over the last 12 or so years or more, or if it had always been that polarized. And I would definitely say, having lived in Canada since about 1973 is when my parents moved us here, I would say Canada, at least in British Columbia where I live, at that time and through the 80s, through the 90s, had been much more kind of politically homogenous, I would say. Yes, of course, there were sort of more conservative people and more liberal people. British Columbia itself had definitely been more on the liberal side. Even my parents, I would say, they were, the classical liberal types in some ways, although I would say they were probably fiscally conservative and conservative in many aspects, but certainly culturally liberal. And British Columbia was more like that. And it was also a higher trust society. We were a very high trust society back in those days. People left, you could steal a car if you really wanted to on any given day in the town where I lived just by checking under the floor mat. Because people would drive their car into town and they would just toss the keys under the floor mat off and leave the doors unlocked. And or you could steal a car from most people's driveways because they left the keys in the ignition. My parents did. We would go to town, leave the doors to the house unlocked, and either leave the keys in the ignition when we parked in town or throw them under the mat. It was really a high trust society, and everyone was like that. Everyone talks about that now. They lament the loss of that. And I think the high trust society does sort of coincide with, of course, this more homogenous political attitudes. People of like mind. There was a lot more continuity to all of that, and of course there was a lot less political angst and a lot less political infighting when it came time to an election. Like, elections were much more peaceful, as I recall them, than they are now. Nowadays, there's protests and people calling each other names and people laughing at each other and mocking each other when they lose, when their side loses an election and whatnot. It's just much more polarized now. That would be my answer to that question. And again, thank you. On my most recent video where I was asking for feedback, Run had said that this idea of attaching labels to people to discredit them rather than, dealing with their ideas is not a new phenomenon, and gave some historical examples. And I guess my only response to that would be that wasn't really my position that it's new. I think what I was getting at when I was talking about how I've noticed it, I think it's more and more lately, it's basically a prevalence issue. It's a prevalence argument that I think it's more prevalent than it's been. I think it's probably been, once we developed language and people realized, because as I've, observed before, I think people are desperate to control and manipulate other people. And it's a lot easier to do it through these sort of subversive means than it is to actually discredit an argument, right? That I think that this has probably been operative ever since we developed language. But I do feel like it's more prevalent, and it could even just be that there are more avenues for that prevalence now. But I would argue that I see it a lot more on for instance, news programs, and news anchors and whatnot. Certainly the opinion journalists do it a lot more than they used to. And I think it even, it's on these panel discussions on CNN and Fox and things like that, right? You see a lot more of this where people will just use the label rather than deal with an argument. And more so, and again, this may just be because we have more avenues to do it amongst the common people, right? So now it's all over Facebook, all over TikTok, all over Twitter X, where people do this to each other, and they do it with each other. Groups of people will talk about someone, and of course, if you read through some of these threads, it's just a bunch of people engaging in what I was talking about in the last video, even talking about other people, saying, fuck them for noticing, and then applying the labels, and that's all they do. They don't give any evidence for the points that they would be supporting. So it's really, for me, just kind of a prevalence thing. VRYC, I think is the username, had posted a comment about scale, and in my preliminary reading of that comment this morning, it's something I'm going to have to think a lot more about, and perhaps even do some more research or ask you to even expand on that comment further. Because it seems to me to be it's kind of a complex comment. And it's a concept that I think I superficially understand, but it's going to be fodder for a few hot tub deliberations, let's put it that way, for me to really go through the depth of your comment and try to apply it to what I observe. I'll close the video by commenting on a Tucker Carlson video that I watched last night, which kind of chilled me. It's a recent video. It's since the Venezuelan invasion and ousting of Maduro. It's one in which he interviews Megyn Kelly. So if you're looking for it, if you're curious, the thumbnail has Megyn Kelly on it. And it's obviously within the last week. And what chilled me about it was there seems to be a bit of a change in him. And, I've watched Tucker Carlson for a long time. I did used to see him before he was on Fox, before he took over the O'Reilly show. I'll give you a brief history on that. I started watching Bill O'Reilly many years ago, and I did it ironically. I used to watch him and yell at the TV, Now the interesting thing about that is, over the years, I found a little more agreement with him, and I don't know, who was changing, he or me. I don't agree with him on everything, obviously. However, a lot of the things that he used to say that I disagreed with, most of them were claims about the culture war, the slippery slope arguments. The problem for me is that he wasn't wrong in retrospect on a lot of the things that he said. A lot of the things that he claimed were going to be a result of the culture war. He wasn't wrong. He may not have been 100% right, but he wasn't wrong. He certainly wasn't as wrong as I seem to feel he was in the moment. And by the time Tucker Carlson took over the show, I wasn't yelling at the TV anymore. Yes, I disagreed with him quite often, but it didn't seem as egregious to me by the end. Tucker Carlson I watched less ironically, and over time I came to appreciate some of the things that he did, because, here's a guy who, and this is where it feels like the change has occurred. Here's a guy who basically publicly browbeat himself for having initially championed the cause of the Iraq War. He said publicly many times that he got it wrong, that he wished he had never supported the invasion of Iraq and all of that. And I always kind of appreciated that. Whether I was being manipulated in that or not, I don't know. But, taken at face value, I thought there was value in that, in admitting your faults. The video that I watched last night, he seems to have taken a bit of a turn. And basically what he's saying in that video is that the invasion of Venezuela and the ousting of Maduro marks a return to kind of an imperialist empire in the United States, and it's naked. It's not something that people are trying to hide now, and he applauds that. He's for that. He likes the honesty of a Trump saying, which I actually haven't even heard this yet myself. I heard Trump saying that they were going to send in the oil companies, they were going to fix the infrastructure, the oil companies are going to spend billions of dollars, and they're going to give the profits to the Venezuelan people. And they're going to run the country for a while, and then they're going to judiciously hand it over, whatever that means. It's sort of like beginning a relationship on a rape or something like that. It's like, but then you're going to judiciously, have a good relationship or something. Glossing over the unjudicious part, potentially anyway. I mean, make your argument, I guess, that the ousting of Maduro was somehow judicious itself, but of another leader, right, of a sovereign nation, whatever. But Tucker was saying that Trump has since said and admitted that they're there for the oil. And obviously, there's a reason why we're ousting Maduro and not the leader of North Korea. Especially when you consider the platitudes that are made by some. This is more amongst other members of his administration. And boy, watch the press release video of Lindsey Graham threatening the Iranians and others. Boy, he's very excited. He's walking around wielding a big stick or a big dick, it seems. That's quite chilling to me. But at any rate, as I was saying, there's a reason why we're ousting Maduro. I mean, Venezuela has got the world's largest oil reserves, at least for such a geographic region or per capita, whatever it is. I mean, they obviously have a lot of oil reserves, and there are a lot of analysts right now saying this is really about World War III. This is about wanting to secure the oil reserves necessary to fight another global war. And as Tucker alluded to, he's expanded the Pentagon budget by a substantive amount. The authors of the Project for a New American Century documents would have just been beside themselves at the prospect of expanding the Pentagon's budget by as much as Trump just did. Quick next day clarification there. Yes, I'm aware Trump didn't unilaterally expand the budget for the Pentagon. He's applied for an increase in the Pentagon's budget. We'll see what happens if that falls short. We'll see if he tries to, just use the pen to do that, I suppose. So it seems like he's at least being prepared for something. That's frightening to me. And of course, where does that money go? Well, it's more deficit finance, right? Because, of course, as I've always said, when you're already spending at a deficit, any new expenditures are necessarily born from debt. You already don't have the money. And that's one of my biggest criticisms of him, because I think that's wholly immoral, fraudulent. It's fraud. You're spending money in the name of people who can't consent to that. They will be paying that back. Not to mention what the money is really used for. This is a killing people budget, right? That's what it is. That's what all of this stuff really is. Next day clarification number 2. When I say that, keep in mind I'm not a pacifist. I believe any nation has the right to defend itself. So this is to distinguish between a military budget, a pure defense budget, and the kind of imperialist budget it would seem that Donald Trump is trying to pass now. I think that, a lot of the, let's say, military escapades and even you know, the covert escapades that the U.S. has been engaged in for many, many years, certainly since 1956 anyway, have not been necessary defenses of the U.S. homeland due to a direct attack, you know, many of them. So that's what I'm referring to there. I'm certainly not a pacifist, if that's what that remark might have seemed to indicate. At any rate, Tucker Carlson seemed to really appreciate the honesty. And he even went as far as to say, you know, this is the new paradigm. That one act, that night, going into Venezuela, constitutes a change, a big change. It's a global change. It's not just a change in U.S. policy, etc. It represents a global change. The world order has just shifted. The UN is now absolutely castrated, essentially. It'll continue to exist, but it really will have no power because the U.S. is going to act, you know, imperially, and it's going to act with its own authority globally. And he supports it in a way. He didn't really. He said he was extolling the virtues of the honesty of it, I guess, is what he was doing. He wasn't necessarily saying he supports the imperial nature of it, but he also didn't say that he was against that. And he even talked about how, you know, if you want to argue against it, if you want to say it's immoral, there's no point because that is the state of affairs now, so stop. He literally said that. Tucker, in my experience, has not been a guy who's told people to stop making the moral argument. You know, that's the only way we stop a bully when we don't have the power to stop a bully, right? Is we implore them to act morally. And, you know, I've always pointed this out, that people who had typically declared morality as purely subjective, that there's no such thing as objective morality, I've always pointed out that they don't live that way because generally speaking, they make all kinds of moral pronouncements of their interlocutors or their neighbor or whoever they're talking to or about. Is they say that's immoral, you know, as though their personal subjective morality would really mean anything to anyone else. And, you know, along with, if you're being honest with yourself, along with the declaration of morality as subjective would have to come the recognition that you hold, but, you know, like 1/8 billionth of the morality, you know, of the planet. You know, in other words, you have your morality, but you can't really appeal to someone else that theirs is immoral and yours is moral. They feel the same way, but the opposite, of course. You can make arguments with people, I suppose, and try to convince them of to come to your morality, but you can't really make what people essentially do is they make objective statements about subjective morality. And ultimately, that's what people would do, again, in the face of this force doctrine type bullying or imperialism, is to make the moral argument. To make the moral argument that that's not right. And that you ought to stop, you know, because it's immoral. Like we appeal to one another. And I think that happens even on the ground, like just in our day-to-day lives. I think there's a lot of people who might be doing something that they kind of know is wrong. And they just do it anyway out of human weakness or just desire sort of trumps their sense of ethics in the moment. And then they get caught and people, you know, berate them. A judge might give them a stern lecture, or other people, if it's in school or something like that, a teacher or some other authority figure, or your friends might give you a stern talking to, and you kind of go, yeah, you're right. And will often in that situation, people caught in that kind of a situation may even make an effort, you know, from that point forward to change their behavior once it has been brought into the light, right? In that manner. Now, I'm not saying that Trump would do that. No, not in the least. What I'm suggesting is that it's an odd thing to do, to suggest that people abandon their moral arguments when, in the face of such a thing, that's what we would do. We would engage in, roundtable discussions and debates and protests where we would make the moral arguments, where we would implore each other to think about that and to put pressure, at least, on, a government such as the US to change its ways. Like, we're pretty complex beings, right? Biologically and, cerebrally, morally, ethically. And it just really struck me that here was Tucker telling people to stop making the moral argument in the face of, essentially an imperialist bully, That struck me. What also struck me was Megyn Kelly came on and he asked her for her opinions on the situation in Venezuela and what it means. And she basically made all the points that I would make. Like, I would say in that instance, as you know, I never fully attach my wagon to any given person. Everyone has blind spots, they'll let you down. But in that moment, certainly, I'm with Megyn on pretty much every point that she made. And the interesting thing is she was pushing back in a way. I don't know if she listened to his monologue that was before that. I doubt it, because this isn't like broadcast television, right? The Tucker Carlson Tonight Show, the guest waiting in the green room or whatever would actually hear the monologue. They would often comment directly on the monologue. But in this instance, I don't think she necessarily heard the monologue. I could be wrong, but either way, she pushed back against a lot of the things, again, indirectly. And I'm with her pretty much on every point she made. The interesting thing to me was that Tucker didn't really seem to acknowledge that in many instances he'd said seemingly the opposite. Maybe not the diametrically opposed opposite, but what he was saying was not similar to what she was saying. He kind of just seemed to go along with it. I found that kind of odd too, because Tucker's not the kind of guy normally to shy away from pointing out the areas of disagreement, even with they claim to be friends, even with a friend, like he seems to be the guy who's pretty honestly interested in real engagement, real conversation. And he didn't really push back. It was a very interesting conversation. Again, Megyn pulled it back a lot for me in that conversation. I recommend it if you're interested. It's again, I found what Tucker said initially very chilling, because it was a declaration in a way, his interpretation at least of what the invasion into Venezuela means, and the decapitation of a world leader like that. Final next day clarification. Obviously, what I'm referring to there is the decapitation of the government, right? Not suggesting that I think Nicolas Maduro had his head chopped off in that fashion, where, there are arguably other leaders that so similarly deserve the same treatment. If this was a moral thing to do, if this is something you can support, you got work to do, I guess, and of course this to me sort of represents far more of a return to the neocon and just classical American behavior, actually, as a country, of, going back to 1956, for instance, and many other things, and speaks to, maybe being potentially aware of a renewed need for false flag operations to keep the American populace engaged, because I do think, engaged, in other words, in support for the various ventures that the American government may take on, right? Because, if this truly is a return to that sort of imperialist empire kind of behavior, they're going to need to engage in some more of these good old-fashioned false flag operations to keep the American public in line. And the fly in the ointment there, I would say, gets back to the question that I was asked by Eat Reut earlier about the polarization of the electorate, of the voting base for these various governments. And that's the real fly in the ointment. I mean, you could end up with some kind of a civil war situation. And a lot of that depends on the midterms and the next federal election and where we go from here. And, let's not fool ourselves into thinking that somehow the Democrats are not also somewhat frothing at the mouth at the idea of this renewed power in the administrative body, because they're just as bloodthirsty. And, one need only look at the presidency of Barack Obama in some ways to see that. And of course, they all have the same, they all deal with the same lobbyists and kind of the same donors in a way. I mean, these billionaire class donors, they have an agenda. They're the most powerful lobby group, right? Is the big ass donors. And so, but they still need to somewhat keep the electorate in line. Like they need the consent of the governed, at least to some degree. And I would say that the governed is certainly more polarized these days. I'm not sure a full-scale civil war could ensue. However, that is a bit of a problem, I think, for the ruling class. I think they have pushed, I think they encourage this increased division because it gives them more authority in a way. But I think there are limits to all of these things. You can have a breaking point where you end up pushing the division a little too far, and now it works against you. And that's quite possible here, although, it gives you more, it does give you more authority too if things start getting really out of hand, because you can start cracking down on the First Amendment and things like that, which, there are a lot of people who salivate at the idea of that too. So it's amazing to see how much ebb and flow and posturing and strategizing and whatnot goes on when it comes to these things. And really, it's all back to the same thing that I've discussed before. People desperate to control and manipulate other people, especially where resources are concerned. Lots of people have quoted cui bono and whatnot, and it really is fundamental. Like, you really just need to look at that first, because that's usually where your answers are going to lie. At any rate, as per usual, I would love to hear your feedback on that. And again, I'm going to delve into this concept of scale over the next few nights' hot tub deliberations and see what I can come up with. Thanks for watching.